The sky burned with streaks of orange as Ethan's ship spiraled out of control. Alarms blared and every system seemed to scream in protest. He wrestled with the controls, cursing under his breath as the rocky alien terrain rushed up to meet him. The crash was anything but graceful. Smoke billowed from the wreckage, and Ethan staggered out, coughing, a mix of sweat and soot streaking his face. The desolation of the alien planet stretched before him, a bleak, jagged landscape under a blood-red sky. He had barely taken a step when a voice, lilting and laced with amusement, cut through the stillness. Well, that was impressive, if your goal was to create the ugliest crater in the galaxy. Ethan spun around, hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. Standing atop a nearby ridge was a figure that seemed almost unreal. Her skin shimmered in hues of light purple with a pinkish glow, her hair cascading in waves like molten silver. Her curvy silhouette was both regal and intimidating, but it was her smirk, half amusement, half challenge, that made his jaw tighten. "Who are you?" Ethan barked, keeping his blaster steady. "Liana," she replied, her tone as breezy as the planet's winds. "And judging by your attempt at a landing, I'd say you're lost, clumsy, or both." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Listen, I don't have time for jokes. My ship's down, my comms are fried, and I need my help?" she interrupted, sauntering closer. Her steps were unhurried, her confidence radiating like a beacon. "Oh, don't look so surprised. I saw the crash from miles away. Your kind doesn't exactly blend in." Ethan lowered his weapon slightly, though his suspicion remained. "What do you want?" She tilted her head, examining him like a curious artifact. "Want? Oh, nothing much. Maybe just a little entertainment. It's not every day a human stumbles into my little corner of the universe." "Entertainment?" he echoed, incredulous. "Relax, pilot. I'll help you. But," she added, her smirk widening, "I might enjoy poking a little fun along the way. Call it payment." Ethan groaned. "Great. Stranded on a hostile planet with a comedian." "Hostile?" Liana laughed, a sound as melodic as it was infuriating. "Oh, you? Have no idea, but don't worry, I'll keep you alive. For now." Ethan shot her a glare. "I'll manage on my own." She raised a brow, gesturing toward the jagged cliffs and ominous shadows that stretched across the horizon. "Sure, go ahead. I'm sure the predators will love the taste of human stubbornness." He hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. She noticed and pounced, her tone dripping with mock sincerity. "Don't worry, hero. Stick with me, and you might just make it out alive. Probably." With a resigned sigh, Ethan nodded. "Fine. But if you keep up with the jokes, I'm leaving you behind." "Oh, darling," she said, her voice a honeyed tease. "I think you'll find I'm impossible to leave behind." As they set off across the barren landscape, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if agreeing to her help was a mistake, or if it might just save his life. The sun loomed like a crimson wound in the sky, casting elongated shadows across the jagged terrain. Ethan trudged behind Liana, his boots crunching over gravel and cracked earth. Every now and then, she'd glance back, her teasing smirk ever present. "So, tell me," she said, not even out of breath despite their trek. "Do all humans crash? So dramatically? Or are you just special?" Ethan rolled his eyes. "It wasn't a crash, it was an emergency landing. Is that what you call it? Because from up there it looked more like a toddler throwing a tantrum with a spaceship," he groaned, tightening the straps of his gear pack. "Do you ever stop talking?" "Not when I'm having this much fun." She winked, her voice dancing on the edge of laughter. Despite his frustration, Ethan couldn't deny she moved with the kind of grace that suggested she was far more familiar with this terrain than she let on. Her every step seemed calculated, her eyes scanning the horizon for threats he couldn't even perceive. "So where are we going?" he asked after a stretch of silence, trying to steer the conversation away from himself. There's a ridge, a few kilometers ahead, she said, pointing toward a jagged formation in the distance. Shelter, water, maybe even something edible if you're lucky. If I'm lucky? Ethan quirked a brow. You don't sound very convincing for someone claiming to help. She shrugged, her tone breezy. I'm not here to hold your hand, pilot, just keeping you alive long enough to amuse me. Ethan muttered something under his breath, earning a sharp chuckle from Liana. Hours passed, the planet's unrelenting sun beating down on them. Ethan's shirt clung to his back, his body aching from both the crash and the relentless pace Liana set. You're slowing down, she observed without looking back. I'm fine, he snapped, pushing himself to keep up. Sure you are, but if you collapse, I'm leaving you. Dead weight isn't my style. You're all heart, he shot back. She stopped abruptly, spinning around to face him. Her violet eyes sparkled with something between mischief and challenge. Oh, don't pout, human. It doesn't suit you. Ethan bit back a retort, his patience wearing thin. But before he could respond, Liana's expression shifted. Her playful demeanor vanished, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. Stop, she said, her voice low and commanding. What is it? She raised a hand, silencing him. Her gaze darted to the rocks around them, her posture tense. Slowly she crouched, motioning for Ethan to do the same. A guttural growl echoed through the canyon, low and menacing. Ethan's hand flew to his blaster, but Liana shook her head sharply. Don't, she hissed. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against stone. From behind a cluster of boulders, a creature emerged, a hulking, sinewy beast with 6 legs and a maw full of jagged teeth. Its translucent skin revealed a network of pulsing veins, glowing faintly with bioluminescent light. Ethan's grip on his blaster tightened. What is that thing? A Threxian, Liana whispered, her voice tight. Fast, aggressive, and very, very hungry. Fantastic. The creature sniffed the air, its glowing eyes locking onto them. Liana's fingers brushed against Ethan's wrist, a silent signal. Slowly, she murmured. Move back. No sudden movements. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding as they began to retreat. The Threxian's growl deepened, and it took a step forward, its claws gouging deep grooves into the rock. Okay, he muttered under his breath. If this is part of your entertainment, I'm not impressed. Shut up, Liana shot back, her voice barely audible. Just as they seemed to put some distance between them and the creature, Ethan's boot caught on a loose rock. He stumbled, the sound of his fall echoing through the canyon like a gunshot. The Threxian roared, its body coiling like a spring before it lunged. Run! Liana shouted, her teasing tone replaced by sheer urgency. They bolted, the beast's snarls closing in behind them. Ethan could feel the heat of its breath, the ground trembling beneath its weight. Liana darted ahead, her movements swift and fluid, while Ethan struggled to keep up, adrenaline the only thing keeping his legs moving. Ahead, the canyon narrowed, the walls pressing close together. Liana veered toward a crevice, barely wide enough to squeeze through. She turned, motioning frantically for Ethan to follow. In here! He didn't hesitate, diving into the crevice just as the Threxian's claws raked the air where he'd been a second earlier. The beast snarled, its massive frame too large to fit through the gap. Inside, Ethan collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Liana crouched beside him, her own breathing steady despite the chase. Well, she said after a moment, her smirk returning. That was exciting. Ethan glared at her. You call that exciting? I call it insane. Same thing. You knew that thing was out here, didn't you? Of course. She grinned, her violet eyes sparkling with amusement. But where's the fun in warning you? Ethan groaned, dropping his head into his hands. I'm starting to think the predators aren't the real danger on this planet. Aw, you flatter me. As the Threxian's growls faded into the distance, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what he'd gotten himself into, and why, despite everything, he couldn't shake the feeling that this infuriating alien woman was the key to his survival. The narrow crevice offered a moment of reprieve, but not much else. The confined space forced Ethan and Liana close, their shoulders brushing with every minor movement. "Cozy," Ethan muttered, still catching his breath. Liana smirked, tilting her head toward him. "Complaining already? I thought humans were supposed to be adaptable." "Adaptable doesn't mean comfortable." He glanced at her, his irritation evident. "And I'm not exactly thrilled about sharing space with someone who thinks running headlong into danger is a sport." She leaned back against the rock wall, her expression unbothered. "You're still alive, aren't you? A little gratitude wouldn't kill you." Ethan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Gratitude? For what? Leading me straight into the jaws of a monster?" "That monster would have caught you if not for me," she shot back, her voice sharp but playful. "Face it, pilot, you'd be Threxian Chow by now without my help." Ethan opened his mouth to retort, but stopped when her gaze shifted past him, her smirk fading. "What now?" he asked, his stomach sinking. "Shh," she whispered, her body tensing. Her violet eyes narrowed as she scanned the crevice's dim interior. Ethan followed her gaze. "Camouflage," Liana murmured, her voice low. "Stay still." The shimmer moved, resolving into a serpentine form that slithered soundlessly along the rock wall. It was nearly invisible, its translucent body blending seamlessly with the surroundings. But its size was unmistakable, easily 3 times the length of a man, with rows of sharp, chitinous spines running down its back. "Great," Ethan muttered under his breath. "Another predator." Liana shot him a warning look. "Keep your voice down. If it senses us—" The creature paused, its head turning toward them. For a moment, the air seemed to freeze. Ethan's grip on his blaster tightened, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Don't!" Liana hissed, noticing his movement. "If you shoot, we're done for." "What do you suggest?" he whispered back, barely moving his lips. She didn't answer immediately, her eyes locked on the creature. Then, slowly, she reached into a small pouch on her belt, retrieving a vial filled with a shimmering liquid. "What's that?" "Bait," she replied, her tone clipped. "Bait?" Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "You just carry that around?" "Always prepared," she said with a faint smirk, though her focus remained on the creature. Before he could protest, she hurled the vial toward the far end of the crevice. It shattered on impact, releasing a cloud of glittering mist that seemed to hum faintly. The creature's head snapped toward it, its elongated body uncoiling as it slithered away from them. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That was convenient. Liana leaned back, her smirk returning. "You're welcome." Ethan narrowed his eyes at her. "And what would have happened if that didn't work?" She shrugged. "We'd improvise." "Improvise? That's your plan?" He shook his head, incredulous. "You're unbelievable." "And yet you're still here," she quipped, brushing dust off her pants as she stood. "Come on. We've wasted enough time hiding." Ethan followed reluctantly, muttering under his breath. "I'm starting to think you enjoy this." "Enjoy what?" "Putting me through hell." She laughed, the sound echoing softly in the narrow passage. "Oh, pilot, you make it too easy." They emerged from the crevice into the fading light of the alien sun. The landscape had shifted, the jagged cliffs giving way to rolling dunes of fine, silvery sand. Ethan shielded his eyes against the glare, scanning their surroundings. "Where to now?" Liana pointed toward a distant ridge. "There's a cave system over there. Should be safe for the night." "Should be?" he echoed, his tone skeptical. She shrugged. "Safer than out here." Ethan sighed, falling into step beside her. You know, for someone who claims to be helping, you're not exactly reassuring. Where's the fun in that? As they trekked across the dunes, the silence between them grew heavier, broken only by the crunch of sand beneath their boots. For the first time, Ethan noticed the subtle exhaustion in Liana's movements, the way her smirk faltered when she thought he wasn't looking. You do this often? He asked, surprising even himself with the question. Do what? Play guide, save reckless pilots. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Not exactly. Most people who end up here don't last long. Enough to need saving. Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the planet's dangers. Why help me then? He pressed. She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Maybe I like a challenge. Ethan raised a brow. That's it? No noble reason? No deep, philosophical answer? Her smirk returned, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Would you believe me if I said I find you interesting? He snorted. Not a chance. Smart man. She quickened her pace, effectively ending the conversation. As the ridge drew closer, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than she let on. For all her teasing and bravado, there was a guardedness to her, a vulnerability she seemed determined to hide. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted to understand it. The cave's entrance loomed like a jagged mouth, its shadows swallowing the last rays of sunlight. Ethan hesitated, his instincts prickling. You're sure this place is safe? Liana glanced over her shoulder, her smirk faint in the dimming light. Define safe. Not a death trap, he said flatly. She chuckled. Relax, pilot. The worst thing in here is probably me. Comforting. Despite his reservations, Ethan followed her inside. The air was cooler, carrying a faint metallic tang that tickled his nose. Glowworms clung to the walls, their bioluminescent bodies, casting an eerie blue light that illuminated the cavern. Nice ambiance, Ethan muttered, running a hand along the rough rock. It's not for you, Liana replied, her tone teasing. The glow. Do you ever get tired of this? The sarcasm, the constant needling? Her smirk softened, a rare flicker of sincerity in her expression. Not really. She turned away before he could respond, her movements deliberate as she set her pack down near the wall. Ethan watched her for a moment, unsure whether to press further or let it go. Ultimately, exhaustion won out. He dropped his own pack beside hers and sat heavily, his back against the cool stone. So, he said after a beat, what's the plan now? Liana leaned back, her violet eyes catching the glowworm light. Rest, regroup, figure out how to get you off this rock without dying in the process. Sounds simple enough, he said, sarcasm mirroring hers. See, you're learning. They fell into an uneasy silence, the cave's faint hum filling the gaps. Ethan fidgeted, unstrapping his boots and flexing his sore feet. Meanwhile, Liana seemed perfectly at ease, her legs crossed and her head tilted back against the wall. So, he began awkwardly, you've been here a while, huh? Long enough. What does that mean? She shrugged. Time blurs here. Days, weeks, they stop mattering after a while. Ethan frowned. You make it sound like you're stuck. Her eyes flicked to him, something guarded in her gaze. Maybe I am. Can't you leave? You seem resourceful enough. She let out a soft, bitter laugh. Resourceful doesn't fix a destroyed ship, pilot. And it sure doesn't repair a severed connection to the rest of the galaxy. He studied her, the pieces slowly clicking together. You were stranded here. Smart and observant, she said dryly, though her teasing lacked its usual edge. Ethan hesitated. How long? Her silence was answer enough. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice quiet. Liana scoffed. Don't be. I made my peace with it a long time ago. doesn't mean it's easy. She looked at him, her expression softening ever so slightly. No, it doesn't. For a while, neither of them spoke. The weight of her admission hung between them, fragile and unspoken. Ethan didn't push further, didn't dare. Instead, he let the quiet settle, their shared exhaustion pulling them into an uneasy truce. Eventually, Liana broke the silence. So, tell me something, pilot. Why were you out here in the first place? This planet's not exactly on anyone's travel itinerary. Ethan hesitated. It's a long story. We've got time. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I was on a cargo run. Small job, simple route. But my nav system glitched, and I veered off course. Then I got hit by an uncharted asteroid field. The rest is history. She raised an eyebrow. No backup systems? No distress beacon? He shrugged, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Budget ship. You get what you pay for, clearly. She smirked, but there was no malice in it. What about you? He asked, seizing the opportunity to turn the tables. What brought you here? Her smirk faltered, a flicker of something darker crossing her face. That's another long story. I'm not going anywhere, he said gently. She met his gaze, her violet eyes searching his face. For a moment, it seemed like she might open up. But then she shook her head, her usual mask sliding back into place. Maybe another time, she said, her tone light but evasive. Ethan nodded, respecting the boundary. Fair enough. As the hours passed, they settled into a tentative rhythm. Ethan found himself studying Liana more closely, the way her sharp wit masked deeper wounds, the way her teasing was both infuriating and oddly comforting. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, human or otherwise. And despite the dangers, despite her relentless jabs, he couldn't help but feel drawn to her. Little did he know, she was watching him just as closely, her own walls crumbling in ways she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The following morning brought no reprieve. The sun's first rays cut through the cave's opening, flooding the space with harsh, unforgiving light. Ethan squinted, shielding his eyes, while Liana, Eva, the early riser, was already on her feet. Time to go, she said, her voice a sharp contrast to the stillness of the cave. Ethan groaned, stretching stiff muscles as he slowly stood. Do you ever stop? I could ask you the same thing, she shot back, securing her pack with practiced efficiency. He glanced around, rubbing his eyes. What's the hurry? I thought we were resting. We rest when we're not trying to get killed. Liana's gaze flicked to the cave entrance, her eyes narrowing slightly. And trust me, we're about to head into the thick of it. Ethan's stomach twisted. Great. That's just what I needed. Don't worry, I've got this. They made their way across the barren landscape, the sun now fully risen, its intense heat making the sand shimmer. Ethan's boots sunk into the soft earth with every step, his mind racing. Liana was confident, but there was a tension in her shoulders, something beneath the surface that she wasn't showing. Just tell me one thing, he said, trying to break the silence.
How do you always know where to go? Are you some kind of alien survival expert?
She didn't answer right away, her lips curling into a smirk. Maybe, maybe not. It's just about knowing how to read the signs. Signs? Yeah, she said, scanning the horizon as if expecting something to pop out at any moment. Every planet has its own rhythm, its own pulse. You just have to learn how to follow it. Ethan narrowed his eyes. You make it sound like you're talking about more than just terrain. Her gaze flicked to him for a brief moment, her smirk faltering. Maybe I am. The words hung in the air between them, but before he could press further, a distant rumble interrupted the moment. A series of thundering footfalls echoed from the direction of the Threxian territory. Ethan's heart raced. What the hell was that? Not what, who? Liana's voice dropped to a whisper. Get down! They both crouched, blending into the sand as much as possible, their bodies low against the earth. Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears as the heavy footsteps drew closer. Liana's eyes were fixed on the horizon, her expression unreadable. "Stay quiet," she murmured. "If they spot us, we're dead." The ground trembled slightly as a hulking figure came into view. It was a Threxian, towering at least 7 feet tall, with dark, spiked armor covering its body. Its reptilian eyes scanned the area, a low growl rumbling from its chest. The air seemed to vibrate with its presence. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen Threxians in the hollows, but nothing had prepared him for the real thing. "Stay still," Liana whispered again, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a quiet but firm reminder. The Threxian paused, sniffing the air. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, his body tensing. But then, just as quickly as it had arrived, the creature turned, moving off in the opposite direction. Liana exhaled sharply. That was too close. Ethan waited a beat before speaking. "You knew it was coming, didn't you?" She nodded, a faint smirk returning. "Like I said, I know the signs." "Well, you certainly know how to keep a guy on edge," Ethan muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "Keeps you alert," she shot back. "You should be thanking me." "Thank you for almost getting me killed? Appreciate it." She rolled her eyes. "You're welcome, pilot." They continued their journey, the tension between them gradually easing. But despite the brief relief, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The Threxian encounter had been a close call, but it was clear that Liana was prepared. There was something about her, an intuition he couldn't quite put his finger on. The more he thought about it, the more curious he became about her past. The way she moved with purpose, her confidence when faced with danger. It wasn't just survival instinct. She had been through this before, maybe more times than she cared to admit. "So," he ventured, keeping his voice casual, "you ever think about leaving all this behind? Settling somewhere safer?" Liana didn't answer immediately, her step steady but thoughtful. "I've thought about it," she said finally, her tone softer than usual. "But the thing about leaving a place like this is that it gets into your blood. You can't just walk away from it." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond to that. There was a heaviness in her voice, a complexity that wasn't easy to untangle. He tried a different approach. "Is that why you help people? To keep moving?" Her lips twitched at the corners, the faintest hint of a smile. "Maybe. Maybe I just like having someone to tease." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I'm sure that's it." Her smile grew wider, but then as quickly as it had appeared, it faded. "I help people because it's all I've got left to offer." Ethan didn't speak for a moment, processing the weight of her words. There was more to Liana than he'd realized, and for the first time, he wondered just how much of it she was hiding. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon when they reached a narrow pass, a crevice between two towering cliffs. The wind howled around them, a stark reminder of the untamed wilderness surrounding them. Ethan kept his pace steady, but his mind was elsewhere, on Liana, on her words from earlier. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than the hard exterior she wore. "So," he began cautiously, trying to steer the conversation into safer waters. "What's the next step in your grand plan to get me off this rock?" Liana didn't immediately respond, her attention focused on the rocky path ahead. After a long pause, she glanced back at him, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You sure you want to know?" He raised an eyebrow. "If it involves more near-death experiences, maybe not. But I'm not exactly in a position to refuse your plan, am I?" She chuckled softly, the sound more genuine than it had been in hours. "True. You're stuck with me, pilot." "I've noticed," he said, a playful edge creeping into his tone. Can't say I've completely warmed up to the idea yet. Liana shot him a teasing glance. You'll get there. They moved, on in silence for a few more moments, the path growing narrower as the cliffs on either side closed in. The air was thick with the scent of desert dust, but there was something else, something more pungent. Ethan's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but Liana's voice stopped him. "Hold up," she whispered. He froze, his senses on high, alert. "What is it?" "Something's wrong," she said, her tone unusually tense. "Stay close." Ethan did as she instructed, staying just a step behind her as she cautiously scanned the narrow pass. The sound of soft rustling echoed from deeper within the crevice. Liana's eyes narrowed, her expression focused, like a predator tracking its prey. "Something's following us," she muttered, barely above a whisper. Ethan's heart rate quickened. He couldn't hear anything, but his instincts told him to trust her. "What kind of something?" "Threxian scouts," she replied, her voice laced with a quiet urgency. "They're probably on the lookout for trespassers. And if they find us, it's not just the warlords we'll have to worry about." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The Threxians were one thing, but their scouts? Those were a different breed, quicker, more ruthless. The idea of being hunted in these tight quarters made his skin crawl. "How far behind?" "Too close for comfort," Liana said grimly. "We need to move." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted forward, their footsteps echoing against the narrow walls. The crevice twisted and turned ahead of them, but every step seemed to bring them no closer to an escape. The rustling grew louder, the sound unmistakable now. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing their every move. "We're not outrunning them," Liana muttered. "Not in this pass." "Then what's the plan?" Ethan asked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Liana didn't respond immediately, her gaze flicking from one side of the pass to the other. Then, with a sudden, sharp motion, she grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the wall. "Wait," she hissed. "We're taking cover." Before he could question her, she pulled him into a narrow alcove in the rock, the shadows swallowing them whole. They pressed against the cold stone, barely daring to breathe. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. He could almost feel the weight of the Threxian's gaze, as though it was already scanning the shadows for them. The next few moments stretched into an eternity, the tension almost unbearable. Every minute felt like an hour, the air thick with the scent of sweat and dust. Ethan's mind raced, his thoughts a jumbled mess of survival instincts, strategy, and strangely, Liana. He stole a glance at her, noticing the tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the edge of her weapon. She was calm, composed, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something raw, something real. "You're thinking about something," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Liana's gaze flicked to him, her expression unreadable. "Don't get distracted." "I wasn't," he replied, though the edge of his voice betrayed him. "I just don't like the idea of being hunted." "Me neither." Her tone softened for a moment before hardening again. "But we'll be fine." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I always find a way," she said simply. Ethan didn't respond, but the confidence in her voice planted a seed of hope in him. He had no idea how she could be so certain, but after everything he'd seen so far, he didn't have the heart to doubt her. The steps were almost on top of them now. Ethan could hear the deep, guttural growl of the Threxian scout, its voice rasping as it muttered in an alien tongue. Liana's grip on her weapon tightened. "Wait for it," she murmured. And then, in an instant, she sprang into action. With a fluid motion, she darted from the alcove, her body blending seamlessly into the shadows. Ethan barely had time to react before she fired a quick, precise shot into the air, enough to draw the Threxian's attention, but not to kill it. The scout hissed, turning toward the noise with a predator's focus. Liana was already gone, darting further into the darkness, leaving Ethan with no choice but to follow. "Keep up!" she called, her voice a whisper in the wind. He didn't hesitate. He ran after her, trusting in her lead, his pulse pounding in his ears. The Thraxians' heavy footsteps echoed behind them, but they were gaining ground. For the first time, he felt like he was part of the plan. He was no longer just being dragged along. This time it was his turn to keep up. The narrow passage twisted ahead of them, sharp bends obscuring the path as Liana led the way, a blur of motion in the dark. Ethan's breath was coming in short bursts, his legs burning with the effort to keep pace. His mind was racing, trying to keep up with the sudden burst of chaos. Liana was at least 3 steps ahead, moving with a purpose, her eyes scanning. Every crevice, every potential threat. The Thraxian was gaining, its heavy footfalls reverberating through the pass like a drumbeat of doom. "Liana!" Ethan called through the thick air. She didn't respond at first. It wasn't that she couldn't hear him. It was that she didn't need to. She was too focused. And then, as if she had sensed the question forming in his mind, Liana glanced over her shoulder. "Stay close. Don't stop." Ethan gritted his teeth, pushing himself harder. The walls seemed to close in as the tunnel narrowed, leaving no room for error. They needed an exit, and fast. Ahead, Liana's eyes flicked toward a small ledge jutting out of the rock, just wide enough for a person to scramble up. Her gaze met Ethan's, a silent command. "Up there!" she called, her voice sharp and urgent. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He lunged toward the ledge, planting his hands firmly against the rock as he hoisted himself up. His fingers scraped against the rough surface, but the adrenaline coursing through him made the pain almost secondary. Liana was already at the top, waiting for him. "Hurry!" she urged, her voice carrying an edge of urgency he hadn't heard before. Ethan scrambled the last few feet, reaching for her hand. She gripped it with surprising strength, pulling him up in one smooth motion. They stood there, chest heaving, the Thraxian's growls growing louder beneath them. Ethan risked a glance down, his heart skipping a beat. The creature was mere moments away, its glowing eyes scanning the shadows for them. "Do we wait here?" Ethan whispered, his voice strained. Liana shook her head, her eyes flicking around for another escape. "We don't have time for that." She turned and motioned for him to follow. "Move. There's a way out up ahead." With no other option, Ethan followed her, the ledge narrow and precarious beneath his feet. He could feel the weight of the Thraxian's presence below them, the tension thick in the air. But Liana was already moving, her confidence unwavering. "Stay low," she whispered, lowering herself as she moved across the ledge. Ethan did the same, trying his best to match her pace. His foot slipped once, sending a small rock tumbling down the cliffside. "Shit," he muttered, his heart leaping into his throat. Liana glanced back at him, eyes narrowing. "Quiet!" He nodded, his mouth dry as they crept forward. The Thraxian's growls intensified, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if it had heard them. But then the sound of the creature's footsteps grew fainter, the growls disappearing into the distance. Ethan exhaled in relief. "Close," he muttered. Liana didn't respond. She was already moving again, her focus laser-sharp. They reached the end of the ledge, a narrow opening leading to a small cavern. The air here was cooler, a welcome change from the heat of the desert. But there was no time to appreciate the difference. "Inside," Liana ordered, ushering him into the cavern. Ethan ducked inside just as the last of the daylight began to fade from the world outside. The cavern was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of phosphorescent moss on the walls. Liana didn't stop to catch her breath. She was already moving further into the cavern, scanning the shadows. "Stay alert," she said, her voice barely more than a murmur. "We're not safe yet." Ethan nodded, his senses still on edge. The Threxian scout had been too close for comfort, and they both knew it. He couldn't help but wonder about her, though. Liana's calm demeanor, her ability to handle pressure, it wasn't normal. She was more than just a skilled survivalist. She was a force, a person who had been through things he couldn't even begin to understand. "Liana," he began quietly, his voice hesitant. "What's your story?" She didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the shadows ahead. But when she did speak, her tone was soft. "I don't have a story, Ethan. I'm just a traveler. Just someone trying to survive in a universe that doesn't care about me." He frowned, sensing there was more to it than that. "But there's got to be more to it. I mean, how do you know so much about these Threxians, about survival?" She paused, her expression unreadable. Then, almost to herself, she said, "I've lost everything, and I've had to learn to survive." "You don't get to be where I am without picking up a few tricks along the way." Ethan opened his mouth to ask more, but something in her voice stopped him. There was a rawness there, a vulnerability she didn't want to show. He couldn't push her, not now, not like this. Instead, he nodded, his voice quieter. "I get it. I don't want to be a burden to you." Her eyes flicked to his, and for a split second he saw something soften in her gaze. "You're not a burden, Ethan. You're a pain in my ass, but not a burden." A laugh escaped him before he could stop it. It was weak, a breathless exhale, but it felt good. "I'll take that as a compliment." Liana's lips quirked into a slight smile. Better than the alternative. They shared a moment of quiet, the weight of their situation hanging over them. The Threxian scouts had been too close for comfort, but for now, they were safe. Liana was right. They weren't out of the woods yet. But there was a flicker of something between them now. Something more than just survival. Ethan wasn't sure what it was yet, but he was starting to get the feeling that their journey had just taken a much more personal turn. The cavern was quiet except for the soft rustle of their movements. Ethan leaned against a jagged rock formation, trying to steady his breath. The adrenaline from their narrow escape still buzzed in his veins, but as the moments passed, the tension began to settle into something else. Something heavier. Liana was already on her feet, pacing around the perimeter of the cavern with that same intense focus he had come to expect from her. She seemed restless, even in the relative safety of their temporary hideout. Her eyes flicked to the entrance every few seconds, as if she were waiting for something, or someone. "You okay?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Liana's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing for just a moment before she relaxed. "Just thinking. We can't stay here long. We're too exposed." Ethan stood up, stretching his sore muscles. "How much farther is it to your base, the place you're trying to get me to?" Her expression flickered for a moment, the faintest shadow of hesitation passing over her face. "A few days, maybe more, depending on the path we take." "A few days?" Ethan shook his head, the gravity of their situation hitting him full force. "You're telling me we just escaped one near-death encounter only to walk straight into another?" Liana gave him a wry smile. "This is the part of the adventure you signed up for, remember?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You didn't exactly give me the fine print." She rolled her eyes, the playful banter slipping back into their dynamic. "Fine. Maybe I should have warned you that being stuck with me could get you killed." Ethan chuckled, despite himself. "If it comes to that, I'll just have to make sure you go first." Her expression softened just a fraction, but it was enough for him to notice. For a moment, they both lingered in that quiet space, the weight of their shared tension drawing them closer in a way neither of them fully understood. Then Liana broke the moment, her voice returning to its usual brisk tone. "We should rest for a bit, but don't get too comfortable," she said. "The Threxians won't be the only ones looking for us." Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice to come out steady. He took a few steps toward a nearby rock ledge and lowered himself onto the cool stone, trying to keep his mind from wandering too far. It wasn't that he didn't trust her. He did, in a strange way. But this situation was spiraling into something more than he had bargained for, and the deeper he got into it, the more complicated it seemed to become. Liana moved to the far side of the cavern, her eyes scanning the entrance one more time before settling on a small fire pit in the center. She pulled out a small container from her pack, something he hadn't seen before, and began preparing something over the flames. The crackle of the fire filled the space between them, adding a warmth that was almost comforting. Ethan watched her for a moment, something in his chest tightening as he saw the way she moved. There was a fluid grace to her, an intensity that came not just from her training but from something deeper, something he was starting to see, piece by piece. "Hey, Liana," he began, his voice low. She glanced up, eyebrow raised. "What now?" He hesitated, then decided to ask the question that had been lingering in the back of his mind. "What's your real plan here? With me, I mean. You've been dragging me around all this time. What's in it for you?" For a brief second, she froze, her gaze locking with his. Then she returned to what she was doing, not answering right. Away. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the cavern. "I told you," she said finally, her voice a little softer than before. "I don't have some grand plan. I'm just trying to get by." Ethan wasn't convinced. "That's it?" "You dragged me halfway across the galaxy just to survive?" Liana's jaw tightened, but she didn't meet his eyes. She added a few more dried herbs to the fire, the flames dancing in response. "Survival's not just about staying alive, Ethan. It's about finding a way to keep going when everything's stacked against you." He shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words pressing on him. "Yeah, I get that. But there's something more to it, isn't there?" Liana's gaze flicked up to his again, her expression unreadable. "I don't owe you explanations. Not yet, at least." Ethan felt a sharp pang of frustration, but he held it back. They weren't at a place where he could push her, not yet. Instead, he turned his attention to the fire. The flickering light illuminated her face, casting her features in shadows and highlights that made her look even more otherworldly. There was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite grasp, something guarded, something she wasn't ready to share. Liana finally spoke again, breaking the silence. "You want to know something?" Ethan glanced up, curious despite himself. "What?" "The reason I'm not telling you everything," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "is because I don't trust easily. And I'm not sure I should trust you." The words hung heavy in the air, but Liana didn't look at him as she spoke. She continued to tend to the fire, her movements slow and deliberate. Ethan swallowed, the weight of her admission hitting him harder than he expected. He had known that she was closed off. He'd seen it in the way she handled every situation. But hearing it from her directly was different. She wasn't just distant, she was actively holding back. "And you think I'm just going to trust you?" he asked, his voice a little rougher than he intended. Liana's eyes flicked to him, sharp and calculating. "No, I don't. But you're here, aren't you? And that's more than I can say for most." Ethan opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out. For a moment, he thought about pushing her again, about demanding answers, but something in her tone made him pause. He had his own walls, his own secrets. "Let's just get through this, okay?" he said finally, his voice quieter now. She didn't answer immediately, but the way she met his eyes felt like a silent agreement. For the first time since they'd met, they weren't adversaries. They weren't just two people thrown together by circumstance. There was a shared understanding between them now, a quiet recognition of the fact that they needed each other more than either of them was willing to admit. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something neither of them expected. The night stretched on, the quiet of the cavern broken only by the occasional snap of the firewood as it crackled. In the pit, Liana had fallen silent after their conversation, her focus once again on the darkened mouth of the cave. Ethan sat with his thoughts, the fire casting flickering shadows on the rough walls. But his mind wasn't on the cave or the creatures that might be lurking outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that Liana was hiding something bigger than just survival. He'd seen it in the way she moved, in the way she spoke, the guardedness in her every action. She wasn't just some lone wanderer with a tragic past. There was something more, something that made her both captivating and untouchable. And for some reason, that made him want to understand her more. His eyes shifted to her again, watching. The way her fingers brushed through the pack at her side, her movements precise and deliberate. She was calculating as always, but there was something beneath the surface that seemed to shift in the air between them, a quiet tension that hadn't been there before. "Liana," he said softly, breaking the stillness between them. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "What?" "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low, "about what you said, about not trusting me." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And?" He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "I get it. I don't trust you either." The words hung between them, but instead of feeling like a dismissal, it seemed to invite something more, an acknowledgement of the tension they had both been ignoring. Liana didn't respond right away, and for a moment, he wondered if she would. Then slowly, she stood up and approached him, her eyes never leaving his. "You're a funny one, Ethan." He raised an eyebrow, watching her approach cautiously. "What do you mean by that?" Her lips curved into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of warmth. "You act like you're in control, but deep down, you're just like everyone else. Afraid of losing something you don't even know you want." Ethan's stomach tightened at her words. She was right. He had been afraid of being dragged into something he didn't understand. Afraid of trusting her, even when he could feel that pull between them. "You don't know me," he replied quietly, his voice steady, despite the rush of emotions building inside him. "No, I don't," Liana said, her gaze softening for just a moment before it turned steely again. "But I know what it's like to be afraid, to have something you care about ripped away from you." The silence between them stretched on, heavier this time. Ethan could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, pulling at something deep inside. He wanted to ask her more, to ask what she had lost, what she was hiding, but he held back. She wouldn't answer him now, not when she wasn't ready. Instead, he stood up, his resolve hardening. "So what now? We keep running, hoping we make it to your base before something worse comes after us?" Her eyes locked with his, the unspoken understanding between them palpable. "We don't have a choice, Ethan. There's no turning back." He nodded slowly, the words sinking in. They were in this together now, whether either of them liked it or not. Survival had become more than just a mission. It had become something personal, something they couldn't ignore. "Fine," he said, his voice firm. "But when we get to this so-called base of yours, there are answers. I want to know everything, Liana. About you. About why I'm even here." For the briefest moment, something flickered in her eyes, almost a flash of fear or uncertainty. But it was gone before he could fully read it. She simply gave him a nod, turning toward the back of the cavern. We leave at first light. Get some rest." Ethan watched her retreat into the shadows, her figure disappearing into the dark depths of the cave. He felt a strange sense of frustration coil inside him, but also something else. A pull, a connection. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't sure if it was a pull he wanted to resist. But Liana wasn't an open book. She wasn't someone who would let him in easily. If he wanted answers, he was going to have to earn them. The night passed slowly, with Ethan unable to fully find rest. His thoughts kept circling back to Liana, her words, her actions, and the mystery that seemed to surround her. He couldn't deny it any longer. He was in deeper than he had ever intended to be. And no matter how hard he tried to fight it, a part of him didn't want to leave. At first light, Liana was already awake, gathering her things with quiet efficiency. Her gaze flicked up to meet his when he stirred, her eyes unreadable. "You ready?" she asked, already moving toward the cave entrance. Ethan stood up, feeling the weight of their situation settle on his shoulders once more. "Yeah, let's go." As they stepped out into the early morning light, the desert stretched out before them, vast, endless, and unforgiving. They had no idea what lay ahead, no idea what dangers awaited them, but together they were going to face it, for better or worse. The desert sun beat down on them with a relentless intensity, the air thick and dry as it shimmered above the ground. Ethan squinted against the blinding light, shielding his eyes with a hand, his boots crunching on the gritty sand as he walked beside Liana. She didn't look back at him, her focus unwavering as she navigated the barren wasteland. He noticed that she moved with purpose, her steps quick and determined, as if she had walked this path 1,000 times before. The way her body seemed to adapt so effortlessly to the harsh environment left him in awe. She was everything he was not. But as they trudged through the oppressive heat, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. They weren't just two strangers anymore, crossing paths by mere chance. There was something deeper now, something unsaid, hanging heavily in the air around them. "So, what exactly are we heading into?" Ethan asked, trying to make conversation, despite the oppressive heat that made his throat dry. "You mentioned a base, but you've been pretty tight-lipped about what's actually there." Liana didn't answer immediately. Instead, she kept her eyes ahead, scanning the horizon with practiced precision. After a long stretch of silence, she spoke without looking at him. "It's a safe house. Nothing more, nothing less." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A safe house?" "That's right." Her voice was cold, distant. "Do you always keep things this vague?" he asked, a hint of frustration creeping into his tone. She slowed her pace just slightly, glancing at him briefly with that unreadable look in her eyes. "You don't get to know everything